Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Catherine Duffy, and I am the Director of Professional Development here at SAES. And we are so glad you're here. Welcome to the Whose School Is It Anyway webinar. This is a joint webinar with NAES and SAES. And I'm joined today by Andrew Wooden, who is our Interim Executive Director here at SAES, and David Madison, who is the Executive Director Elect of NAES. Welcome, David and Andrew. Glad you're here.
Hello,
so we've got a few housekeeping items before we begin. Number one, we want you to know that everyone will receive a link to the recording of this. This is being recorded. So if you're not on here live, then you're watching it recorded, we're glad you're here. It usually does take a little bit of time for Zoom to get that recording to us. So we'll have that ready for you next week. You'll also receive copies of the slide deck. It's usually held in our webinar library at the SAES website. So stay tuned for that. Feel free to take notes. We'd love for you to take notes, but know that you will get this slide deck as well. So you don't have to madly take notes. You'll have the information given to you. The recording will be accessible on the website, and we'd love for you to interact. What we talked about briefly is that we'd love for you to be able to put your school name, kind of like what we've done in our box at the top of your Zoom box. If you're on a regular computer, you'll see 3 dots. If you push those dots, you'll see that you can rename your Zoom box, and we'd love for you to add the school that you're representing. Some other ways that you can get involved is that we have the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we have a chat box. And so if you have questions, we'd love for you to put that in the Q&A. And if you would just want to comment throughout the webinar, we'll be chatting along with you. And so feel free to add things to the chat if you want to comment or anything like that. So now that we have gotten all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and share our screen and jump right into whose school is it anyway? I'll make sure I've got this right here. Can y'all see it okay? Great. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started. So whose school is it anyway? This is a very common question that we have at SAES, and I'm sure NAES. And that's why we have David and Andrew on here to help us kind of talk through the best practices of this concept. So let me hang on just a second. So we're going to explore 2 relationships today with our panelists. And the first one is the board and vestry relationship. And the second one is the rector-head relationship. And we feel pretty strongly that these are the 2 most important relationships when it comes to creating good church-school communication and good church-school engagement. Before we begin, I want to launch a poll here. We would love to know what your role is at the school. So the answers you can choose from: head of school, board member, rector, chaplain, or other. So we're going to launch this poll and get you to answer it so we kind of know who we're working with.
Mary Catherine, while we wait for the poll, would you go back to the very first slide?
Certainly.
And maybe David and I can give a little background on who we are really quickly.
Of course.
So I say with a sense of humor, whose school is it anyway? That chapel on that box is my chapel. That's where I went to divinity school, and coincidentally, Marquand Chapel popped right up, and I'm happy to say that that's the church that educated me. As Mary Catherine said, I'm interim ED at SAES. I've been a school head at a number of Episcopal schools. I'm also a trustee of an Episcopal school. David?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Madison. I'm the Executive Director Elect of the National Association of Episcopal Schools. In my previous role, I was the Executive Director of SAES. And then prior to that, I worked at a Episcopal school located in Fort Worth, Texas, pre-K through 12th grade program, All Saints, in every possible role, but finished my tenure there as the assistant headmaster and head of the upper school.
Okay, Okay, well, so we've got a lot of experience here, as you can see, and I think a lot of experience when it comes to church-school relationships. So let's go ahead and share the results so that we know what kind of who we have on the call. We have got, can y'all see that? Can y'all see the results? Okay, we've got 25% of us are heads of school, 19% are board members. We've got 44% rector or chaplain and 13% others. So that gives us a good understanding of what it is that we're, who's on the call and kind of what your perspective is. So let's get into the content. So board and vestry relationship is kind of where we're going to begin. And David, you kind of have a lot of experience around this. And I know you're going to talk a little bit about principles of good practice.
So one of the resources that we frequently use at NAES are our principles of good practice. We have a variety of topics. Anyone can access those on our website, whether you're a member or not. If you go to our website and look under resources, you'll see a tab for principles of good practice. And one of the things that we like to highlight are 4 specific things about governance. So we're not going to get too far into the nuts and bolts, but just 4 general ideas. The first relates to how the parish views the school. So in a parish day school environment, the hope is the parish views the school as a significant outreach of its mission. I just spoke with the school earlier today. We're putting together a vestry board retreat, and we were really trying to highlight some of those points where the mission of the church and the mission of the school deeply align. And that's an ideal situation where the parish can really see the school as just another way of it living into its mission as a parish. The second item relates to school board membership. And so there's different ways to do this, but regardless of whether you do a percentage, a number, whether you have some overlap with how the vestry is involved in selection of board members, you want to make sure that the board of the school has a sufficient representation of the parishioners to really maintain that relationship between the parish and the school. And again, the way this used to be done was by either requiring a certain number or a certain percentage. I'm not sure if that's the only way to do it. Parishes and schools are scrambling to find the best folks for sitting on the vestry, sitting on the board. And so there are different ways to do that. Sometimes it makes more sense to get away from a certain number as opposed to really focusing on the types of people that we need. And there's some other safeguards you can put into your bylaws to maintain the Episcopal identity and the relationship of the school beyond just focusing on the numbers. But regardless of how you do that, there should be a sufficient number of parishioners to represent the parish on the school board. The third point is that church and school leaders are professional. They are exercising their ministry in a collegial partnership. This can be tough. The 3 big friction points: money, personalities, and space. Parish day operations can be challenging. And we start with this idea that we are all partners. We're all on the same team. Even though that can sometimes be difficult, it's like a family. Families sometimes fight, families sometimes argue, but it's important that we do this in a collegial way, again, recognizing that we're all on the same page and we're all trying to advance the same mission. And then finally, it's really important that this idea of Episcopal identity or the church-school relationship belongs to everybody. Lots of times, the rector or the head of school are kind of seen as the key incarnation of this relationship. And that's true. It's important that that relationship is solid. But really, the idea of the Episcopal identity or the relationship between the church and the school only works at a deep level if everybody recognizes the importance. Not just the rector, not just the head, but the full vestry, the full board, the people on staff at the school, for example, the chaplain. Everyone needs to be on board with regard to the importance and the responsibility of maintaining Episcopal identity.
David, to that point that you made, the second point around the representation of parishioners, I think one of the things that I run into, and I'd love for your thoughts on it, is when you have a smaller community where you have a small church that has born, they founded a school years ago, and the church has remained kind of small, but the school has grown. And the challenge that they run into is there will be a 50-50 or a 60-40 kind of representation for the church, but there's just not enough parishioners. What do you think about that? And how could a school manage that and still keep that good representation?
Well, I would explore again. I mean, I think that in the situation that you've drawn in particular, that shows the challenges of a number or a quota, just because it may be a situation where, like, as you noted, if, for example, membership in the parish is on a downward trend, they can really be struggling to try to identify folks that can serve on the vestry. Well, it makes it even more difficult if they're also having to populate 60% of the school board as well. So in a situation like that, again, I think it's important to recognize, are there other ways to have parish representation without a process that really puts the church in a difficult situation? You can do that with either named, a vestry rep. You can do it with a smaller number. I've seen some situations where they've backed away from the majority, but they've had a smaller number, but they're Episcopal trustees. They're appointed by the vestry. They have a longer term. Certain questions, maybe with regard to mission, are reserved to that class. And so that's a way to a creative way to make sure that the relationship between the church and the school is still solid. Vestry oversight is still in place, but it doesn't put the challenge of trying to find 8, 9, 10, whatever the number of folks who are willing to serve, but not just willing, excited about serving. You want to get folks that not just are available. You want to get folks that really are excited and feel called to serve on a school board. In some circumstances, the number may just be too large to try to hit. So I'd just suggest be creative, explore how the vestry is approving slates of school boards. That's another way to approach it. But don't feel like there's only one way to reach sufficient representation. Sufficient representation does not necessarily equal a majority, or does not necessarily equal a certain number.
Yeah, I like that. And I appreciate you saying that, because I think I've run into that just this month. The challenge of trying to find people from the church and from the vestry that can serve.
It's hard.
So, yeah.
So this is a image that we use. Again, this is a parish day school. There's a variety of different types of Episcopal schools. You have parish day schools, you have independent schools, you have diocesan schools. This is a model that we use for parish day school governance. And the point here is just all of the different layers of people involved in a parish day school governance structure. So at the top, of course, you have your diocese. In some dioceses, the bishop is involved. Sometimes there's a commission of schools. Sometimes there's nothing that formal, but regardless, there's a connection to the diocese. The diocese then has a variety of parishes that are run by a vestry, and they call a rector. The rector is the spiritual head of the church. And then what happens is, in a school situation, more often than not, vestries will decide, school operation is complicated. The vestry has its hands full with running the church and supporting the rector and all the other things that are going on in a busy parish environment. So the parish will then call a school board and empower the board to be the governing body of the school. That's ideal because, again, it allows the vestry to do its job, provide oversight, without having the vestry get mired into the day-to-day operation of the school. So we really recommend that a parish creates a school board. The school board then in turn hires its one employee, the head of school. The head of school then hires all the faculty, all the staff for the school. So it's important, everything that we do with regard to governance tries to recognize these different layers and tries to ask the question, what's appropriate interaction look like between the layers? Also, it's important to see where the direct connections are not visible. For example, the head of school is not, in an ideal situation, an employee of the church. The head of school doesn't work for the rector, for example. In this situation, the head of school works for the board. So you don't see a direct connection between head of school and parish. That relationship is maintained by the vestry, creating the school board, overseeing the school board, and then delegating the role to the head to operate the school. So again, I just put this out there to show clear as kind. That's one of my favorite Brene Brown quotes. And it's important that we start with the understanding of where these different layers are, and where the direct interactions are, and where the not direct interactions, but relationship still exists.
Yeah, that's good. So Beth has asked a question or made a comment, but I'm going to wait until the Q&A because I think we might touch on it before we get to that. So hold on, Beth. We're gonna get to that. Okay, so Andrew, shared mission, very different perspectives. Talk to us about kind of how this looks on a practical basis.
Thank you, Mary Catherine. It may be obvious that the church has one perspective and the school board has a different one. But I'd like to think generally first about the shared mission, and perhaps we'll dig a little more deeply into different priorities with regards to outcomes. But I think it's both a celebration of a shared mission and then also the nuance of, as David said, the collegiality relationship between the two entities of understanding each other. So on the next slide, I'll describe in some specificity what I meant by all that. If we have the parish on one side and the school on the other, let's think a bit about how these two lists of bullets differ from one another. So the parish, obviously, everyone is Episcopalian, everyone is volunteering, the church is the authority, people give of their treasure willingly, they're on a different fiscal year, and it's an organization that's runs by volunteers, and it's good. The school, on the other hand, only 15% of the members are Episcopalian. We operate through contracts. We, as a school head and a school board, we have to know a variety of agencies, regulations and expectations, whether that's SAES, NAES, county, state, national. There are a lot of agencies we have to answer to. Tuition is very different from tithing, a different fiscal year, and lots of staff who have contracts. So that seems obvious, but what does it all mean? Well, I think what it means is the goal of both the parish and the school is to reach mutual understanding and agreement on where the common ground is and how to respect each other's values and shared values. When I looked at the left-hand column for the church, I see things that are covenantal, serving, appreciation, journey, a very different ethos. On the school side, I see contracts and expectations of services, and outcomes and regulations. So the two agencies are governed very, very differently, but the beauty, and we'll get to this later on some slides later in the deck, the beauty is the shared mission, the shared history, and a set of shared values, but common understanding, common appreciation of each other. I think the key is to have these two sets of perceptions be under the same mission and vision. David,
Yeah.
do you have a reaction to that?
No, I mean, the challenge here again is both organizations are called to do a similar thing, but they just do it in very different ways. And I'm not married, but I understand that the best way, the recipe for success for marriage is to fall in love, marry somebody, and then use every ounce of energy you have to try to change them and make them more like you. So that we don't want to fall into that trap. And I know that parishes and schools, it's really easy for parishes and schools both to opine, why is the other not more like us? And I would just propose that may or may not be the best way to spend your energy. It may make more sense to recognize, you know what, we're not the same. We're not doing the same type of work, even though we're involved in the same mission. So where are the points where we can recognize that's just different for us? So, campus access is a big one here, just because historically the way that churches have managed access to campus, very, very different from the way that schools manage access to campus, especially within the past 10 years or so. When I started working in schools, campuses were pretty much open. That's changed dramatically. So that's one area where just again, we're called to do the same thing, but we do it in a very, very different way. So those areas where we just are different, we need to figure out how do we manage that, as opposed to how do we, quote, fix that, unquote.
Agree completely.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that kind of brings me to this comment from Beth Phillips on our chat about, and you may speak to this, David, regarding separate incorporation. One problem we have is that our school is not separately incorporated, and yet the school wants to have different personnel policies as for vacation, sick leave, et cetera, than the rest of the church employees. So maybe speak to that, the idea of separate incorporation, and if that matters in terms of the different policies for each entity.
It's a good question, but I don't know if the issue of one incorporation, one nonprofit corp, or multiple nonprofit corps, I don't know if that prevents you from having different policies based on which part of the operation the employee is working for. It's a good question to explore, but in some dioceses, for example, schools cannot be separately incorporated. Right. And so in those situations, I still think those schools are able to manage different work schedules. For example, I mean, sometimes school employees are on a 9-month calendar, church right. employees tend to be on a year-round, amount of vacation time, what the work day is. I mean, for a school, the work day may look like one thing, the church work day may look something different. So I'm not aware off the top of my head of why not having a separately incorporated school would prevent you from being able to have different policies. It'll be a little complicated, but I think you should be able to thread that needle. And do you have thoughts on that?
I think it's common for faculty and staff of a school to have an employee handbook that's very different from what the church's contracts are with their employees.
For sure. In fact, I mean, at my parish day school, I don't think that our church even we were separately incorporated. We weren't in the beginning, then we became separately incorporated, but we always had separate handbooks and policies and procedures. And I think it's important because, again, back to that idea of we're a shared mission, but we're not on the same calendars. We're not on the same work days. So I think it's really important for you to be able to kind of determine that's that functional independence that we're going to talk about a little bit in just a bit. So that's a great question.
So again, fundamentally, we got a follow-up question about, yes, on the school day, but not on accrual of vacation and sick days. And again, that would be something to dig into. If there's a board, the board would make that change to policy. The vestry would approve that. Now, again, if the question is the vestry doesn't want to approve that, then you've got to dig into, well, why?
Right.
And more often than not, the job of working at a school is just fundamentally different from the job of working at a parish. So I don't think you'd have a difficulty in demonstrating why, this particular accrual policy or this particular sick day policy may be different, but it's more in line with what school employees are used to. And so the board would make that policy change proposal. Depending on your environment, the vestry may approve that, or if the vestry is delegated that responsibility to the board may not even need to have that approved by the vestry. That gets into the nuts and bolts of how the board and the vestry interact.
Yeah, good questions. Good questions. We do have another one, but I think we're going to get into it in the next section. So I'm going to hold off on that in just a second. All right. So the next section is about roles and responsibilities of the church and school. And I think we're getting a little bit more tactical now as we walk through that. So Andrew, talk to us a little bit about roles and responsibilities of each entity.
Great. I love this slide because it really goes to what we believe, what we value, what we care about. And it's actually a continuation of what I was speaking about earlier in slides 6 and 7. It begins with a heartfelt appreciation for how the school came into being. The Genesis story comes to mind when I read this first bullet, that we were created by the church for the most of us, and we're cared for by the church, and we're blessed by the church. And the more school heads and school boards can come to appreciate the vision and support from sponsoring parishes, the more authentic the relationship becomes between the school board and the vestry and the church. And then we take a bit of a tack on the second bullet and say an absolute assurance that school boards must operate with defined independence, functional independence. And that's what David and Mary Catherine were alluding to when they responded to the question of there's different work between the school and the board. So there has to be some kind of acknowledgement and hopefully appreciation by the parish and the vestry that a school needs some independence if it's going to operate well. Shared mission, but different set of operating initiatives. And then the third bullet is the flip side of the second bullet. An understanding that rectors and vestries have appropriate interest in safeguarding the Episcopal identity. This morning when I woke up, I was blessed by the NAES newsletter and a statement on NAES's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. There was the Episcopal identity reminding me as a school head or as a trustee of an Episcopal school that I have to keep Episcopal identity front and center in my thinking as I do the strategic planning for the school. So that's a very real example of how we have to understand that rectors and vestries want to safeguard Episcopal identity, and the more we appreciate, the more we're likely to do so. Next slide. So again, we have these two different columns. The church oversees various aspects of EI, just talked about that, empowers the school board to operate and set policy for the school, that's the independence, maintains positive church-school relations and communication, head makes regular reports, and I'd say even more than reports, makes regular conversations and regular common understandings, so it feels as though truly the head is one with the vestry. And the church insists on financial transparency between the school and the parish, and as David would say, no surprises from the school to the vestry or church. And then on the other side, where it says the school, I think that could also say the school board. We have this independence at the school board level where we are responsible for all the hiring, supporting, evaluating. We set the school's mission, vision, and strategic direction, but with the understanding of Episcopal identity and the mission that the church had for the school, the responsibilities that come with working with vestry reps and rector, but we also have the fiduciary responsibility for sound management of our own school. So when I look at these two columns, I almost want to make a triangle, and at the top of it, you have the head who is straddling both the school board and the church vestry and playing a role in keeping the two in honest communication with each other and appreciating the two roles and keeping them from becoming at odds with one another. David, your thoughts?
Nothing to add to that.
Okay.
So great. So that's, so one of the most tactical ways that we can kind of approach some of these things, and we've got some questions that I might throw out here after this slide, is around having a shared use agreement. And we always encourage parochial schools to have a shared use agreement where you sit down and you spend some time talking about, for your unique situation, what are the things that we agree upon together, and that we are going to handle things a certain way. One of the things that we did at St. Albans is we created a shared use agreement that began with a covenant, and it created it set the stage, I think, for kind of defining the relationship. How do we live together on this campus and in this community as partners and collaboratively? How do we define that? And it was in a covenant language, and it really, I think, helped, especially as we began to find a new head of school or a new rector. What does it look like to be in covenant relationship with each other? Some tactical ways or components to consider putting in a shared use agreement, beginning with the covenant, like I talked about, shared costs such as utilities and insurance, shared employees. How do we handle shared employees? How do we do repairs and maintenance? How do we do major maintenance? Those are two different things. If we have repairs and maintenance, we have an air conditioner that goes out in the parish hall and we both use the parish hall. What do we do with that versus a major maintenance? The roof caves in. We just had 8 inches of rain here in about 6 hours, and we had some roof issues. So what do we do? Possible improvements to the property, possible capital campaigns and other joint fundraisers. How do we manage the procedures for using a shared space? I used to get in trouble all the time for forgetting to tell somebody at the church that I needed to borrow the church lounge for something. So I think that's these shared use agreements are things that we can do to make sure that we all understand kind of how we're going to do it. So one of the things that got brought up was Stephen Karcher says, we've had real challenges where the school sought to fund site upgrades led by the head after a site water damage disaster. Are there thoughts on how the rector with no voice can respond to such pressures and to board independent action on modifications? So I think that has to do really with the kind of improvements to the property. David, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, a couple things. I mean, ideally, your shared use agreement talks specifically about what happens if there's a loss. So how do we handle the deductible? Is it a split based on where the damage is? And I don't know if this is a shared campus or not. So I don't have all the information I need, but in a situation where there's been a loss to some of the property, the how the repairs are done really should be something that's done in concert between the board and the vestry. Now, that doesn't mean you got to get the entire board together and the entire vestry together. But part of the question talked about, how if the rector doesn't have a voice or a vote, what's the way forward? Well, there's still, regardless of the rector status on the board, there should be either a facilities committee or something that involves voices from both the parish and the school, if it's a shared campus, for them to work through those issues. If there's not a formal structure, that would, my first recommendation would be, how do we create that? How do we set it up to where it's not just the rector who's having to handle this, but how are facilities questions handled? And if it's not addressed in the facilities use agreement as well, then that's an indication that we need to either have a facilities committee or talk about the best way to respond to that. So
Yeah, I agree with
the
that.
direct counsel to the rector at this point would be, that's something that needs to be on both the vestry's to-do list and the board's to-do list, because you've identified something that's less than optimal. And then we've got to get those groups together to talk about how do we address this moving forward.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Okay, so trust, that's really the basis, David, isn't it? The trust in the collaboration.
And there's an element of, I'm guessing that there was an element of a surprise in that question. I mean, at some point, decisions were made that not all of the parties were involved in. Well, that's the best way to make sure to erode trust is surprise the other person a whole lot. Make decisions about space allocation, make decisions about, whatever, and don't tell the other party. That's a great way to erode trust. So first and foremost, we recommend that everyone covenants to a no surprise piece, a no surprise promise, where we're not going to do things, even if it's within our authority. We're sure there's some process in place for us to express our intentions, to talk about that. And if it's a decision that has an impact on both organizations, well, we need to explore how do both organizations make sure they're represented around that table in the decision-making process. So first and foremost, just make an agreement. We're not going to surprise each other. That being said, there's still, again, personalities, space, and money. Most of the conflicts that we see have something to do with one, or in really interesting situations, all three of those can be involved. We need to remember that everyone around the table, we're leaders, and we're leaders in a church environment. Even if we work for a school, we work for an Episcopal school. So we need to make sure that we're modeling appropriate conflict management in those situations. And also, even when we don't agree, we're demonstrating consistent support of each other, particularly in that head rector role. That can sometimes be a contentious role, a contentious situation, just because both leaders are trying to do their best for their own organization, for the organization they represent. Let's not forget we're all on the same team. And even though you may represent or be directly employed by the school, or you may represent or be directly employed by the church, it's still one organization. It's still one entity, regardless of the things that we talk about, separate incorporation, separate campus, whatever. There still is that relationship in a parish day school environment.
Yeah, so that rector-head relationship, that's the key, and it's something that we talk about a lot. I do have a question after we get to this point. I have a question about that, but I'm going to let's talk a little bit about what should the rector's role be in the school?
So 4 things I want to highlight. 1, there should be appropriate engagement in the life of the school. Now, the important thing there is appropriate engagement. What does that mean? Well, the rector shouldn't fall into a situation where she or he is never seen. That's not appropriate. But also the rector probably shouldn't be, in a situation where she or he is in every class every day. And so we have to kind of manage what's appropriate engagement look like. I do think regular visits to campus make a lot of sense. I think cultivating the relationship between faculty and staff, that makes a lot of sense as well. Figuring out what's the best way to cultivate a relationship with parents of the community, while also recognizing that the head of school is the CEO of the organization. So in cultivating that relationship, you don't want to do anything that would erode the head's CEO status. And also being an engaged member of the board and committees where appropriate. So I do think that the rector should be a member of the board. I think we had a question where a rector or a situation where a rector had no voice or vote in a parish day situation. That feels a little bit odd to me. I'd want to drill down on that a bit. I've seen situations where sometimes the rector is a voting member, sometimes the rector is not a voting member. I think either way is fine on that, but I do think that the rector should be in a parish day situation, involved and a member of the board. In some of our dioceses, that's prescribed by canon. The rector is the chair of the board unless the rector delegates that. So make sure that you're in compliance with your local canons as well. The rector's job is to represent the school to the larger community, to the church community, making sure that even though the rector is not the head of school, the rector does represent the school, particularly in the church environment. It's important that the rector is aware of what's going on. The rector is making sure that the parish is excited about all the great things that are happening on the school campus. The rector is the spiritual leader of the community as well. Depending on the size of the school, depending on the arrangement, it's not inappropriate for the rector to oversee or have some role in the chapel and the religious curriculum. In lots of schools, the rector has delegated that. Sometimes that depends on the size of the school. Sometimes that depends on the local context. I was in a situation at a school where for a chapter of the school, the church was very, very in the religious instruction, to the extent that the classes were taught by clergy of the parish. As the school grew and grew and grew, the church made the decision, we can't take that on anymore. That's too large of a commitment for us. And then what happened is the relationship kind of morphed into the rector overseeing the chapel, not necessarily being there for all the services, but having some input with regard to what the services look like. And then shifted more into a curriculum piece where the rector and the clergy were not on campus delivering the courses, but did have insight about what we think should be contained in the courses. So that can look different from school to school, but it does make sense for the rector to really be involved in the spiritual leadership of the community. And finally, in an ideal situation, the relationship between the head of school and the rector is really, really deep, where they have each other's backs. The head of school knows that she or he can go to the rector and really put everything on the table, talk about the challenges, be it with the school, be it with the parish, whatever. And that really is an important part of that successful partnership. Mary Catherine, I know you benefited from that when you were head of school at St. Albans. Would you like to speak to the importance of that situation, knowing that the rector can be the head's confidant?
Yeah, I think I can't think of any more critical relationship that I had during my time as a head of school than the rector. And that relationship is just absolutely, the trust is pivotal for the success of the head of school. And so I would encourage, and I think it begins with just that. We're going to talk a little bit about some practical ways to build that relationship, but just being there for each other and having each other's backs. That's a great way to put it. So let's now talk about, we've talked about the rector's role in the school. What, Andrew, would you say would be the importance of the head of school's role in the church?
Thank you. I'd start right where Mary Catherine and David ended, which is the partnership between the head of school and the rector. When I was head of a parish day school, that relationship with the rector was everything for me. And so I'd start there. But it's important to note that though some Episcopal schools have priests for heads, often the head is not a priest, perhaps an Episcopalian, but if an Episcopalian and not a priest, maybe that's a different relationship with the church. And often the head is not an Episcopalian. So different heads are going to think about these 4 points in different ways. Obviously, there has to be engagement in the church. The same way David was talking about the importance of the rector being seen at the school, the head should be seen in the church in a healthy role. However, that head determines that's best for them and their families. The second one is a mirror of what David said. The head has to represent the church, has to speak well of it, has to demonstrate clearly the head's support for the parish. The partnership of the rector with the rector, we've gone over deeply. And then the fourth point is the obvious and most important one, and that is honest communication. We heads are often taught that civility can be the enemy of collegiality. I love the tradition of us being polite and civil. we also need to speak the truth and be honest with what we're struggling with and the differences that we're carrying. But it is honest communication that will make that relationship possible. I'll end there. And Mary Catherine and David, would you add anything to that, or is that good?
No, I think what you said about that transparency is critical, and I cannot state it enough. What we're going to talk about now is just the best practices for ways to really cultivate a relationship, the things that you should be thinking about and doing. And the first is regular meetings. I don't know anybody who's doing well in their relationship that isn't meeting regularly and talking about the things that need to be talked about. I would say weekly meetings are pivotal for a rector and a head to talk about what's happening in each organization, to talk about how that affects each other. That's just critical. Again, the communication, but no surprises, supporting each other. I think to Andrew's point, I was an Episcopalian. It was easy for me to be supportive of what was happening in the church because that's also my church, right? But even if you're not, it is critical that you support each other in what each entity is doing. And that from the head of school's perspective, that's knowing kind of what's happening in the church. If there are things that are big things that are happening, and being supportive of that. And then just being engaging with each other, being faithful stewards of finances and facilities and people. That's just these are practical things that you can do. Before we get to the Q&A, I want to just make sure that I've offered some thoughts on ways that rectors can, additional ways that rectors can support the head of school. The first is to take the time to know what is happening in the day-to-day kind of life of the head of school. It is so helpful and I'm not talking about little details. I'm talking about major issues. If you're having an employee issue or you're having any kind of issue like that, it's good for the rector to kind of have that ongoing context, because then you aren't starting over every time. I would say encourage the head of school to take his or her vacation days. This is not something heads are great at. Self-care is not our best event. We tend to go and forget that we need to take care of ourselves as well. As Connie Wooten, my friend Connie Wooten used to say, put on the oxygen on yourself first before you put it on everyone else. Make sure that the head of school knows that you will not triangulate them, that you will have their back. I'd say prayer for and with the head of school is critical, and remembering that it's a lonely job, and that relationship between the rector and the head is just absolutely pivotal in making it something that you can do on a day-to-day basis. So let's jump in and have some questions. I want to first, there's a question that was emailed in, and it kind of speaks to the role, and I may need a little bit more information from David Jackson about this, but it says, please discuss the distinction in role functions between the rector as the nominal head of school versus a school or preschool director. David, I'd love to know a little bit more, David Jackson, if you don't mind putting in the chat a little bit more about what you're talking about, because we're not quite sure what you mean by a nominal head of school.
While he's doing that, I'm a little bit familiar with the situation, but I'll let him share whatever he'd like to on that. The one thing I would recommend is going back to that pyramid. Any lack of clarity is going to potentially be a problem. So if there's a program director, but then the rector also has the title of head of school, that could potentially lead to some challenges, because one of two things could happen. Certain responsibilities, certain decisions that really should be handled by the director can sometimes get pushed up to the rector / head of school. That can be a challenge because the rector has a full-time job. The rector's running a parish, so there's a full-time job there. It also can be a situation where we really need to make sure that we have the right skill set in the office of director / head of school. And if there are systems in place that don't fully put that person, for lack of a better way to describe it, in the saddle, that can present some challenges as well. So I'm going to visit with him a little bit later. We'll get into the nuts and bolts of that. But my initial read on that situation is it feels like there's lack of clarity on who should be doing what. And so I would suggest that's the first place to start with that question.
Yeah, thanks, David Jackson, for asking that. And those are great. That's a great question. Okay, so I want to go back to a question about parish member. Is there any parish member who cannot serve on the board? For example, the church treasurer. I don't think that I've known a situation where that there was a particular role in the parish that couldn't serve on the board. David or Andrew, do y'all have thoughts on that?
I'm not aware of any. I mean, none come to mind. I mean, I think it could be challenging to have the church treasurer also be the school treasurer. That could be challenging, maybe just because that's a lot. But
Yeah.
Nothing comes to mind. Andrew, anything come to mind for you?
No, I think the proof is in how well the onboarding is done onto the school board and the clarity of roles. So I wouldn't think that there would be someone who would be excluded from the school board because of their position, but there'd have to be an understanding of the role.
Right.
And in the cultivation and the onboarding of the trustee, I think those ripples can be smoothed.
So here's a question about Episcopal identity. Is there a best practice regarding Episcopal identity? Because none of the upper tier staff in our school is Episcopal, and I need to translate this concept into practical, concrete terms. Is it worship, religious instruction, prayer at the beginning of the class? How would you define maybe Episcopal identity to people who are not Episcopal?
So a couple of things. First thing I would say is if you're an NAES member, take a look at 2 webinars that we just hosted a couple of weeks ago. The first was Episcopal Identity for New Heads, and the second was Episcopal Identity for New Administrators. We get into the nuts and bolts of this in those webinars, but basically what I would say is there's 4 different pillars of Episcopal identity: worship, religious study and formation, community life, and social justice, a dedication to the long-held tradition of Christ being dedicated to the marginalized. So if you take a look at those webinars, it'll go into the nuts and bolts. And on those webinars, we have different administrators that share how they express the understanding of Episcopal identity. If the issue is that the top tier administrators in your program may not have an understanding of Episcopal identity, then it's just a question of what can we best do to educate them. I would look at those webinars. I would look at our principles of best practice on furthering Episcopal identity. That's another great resource to go to. All of those are on our website under resources, or feel free to email me as well. Andrew, your thoughts?
No, I think you've covered it perfectly. And Mary Catherine, there's also a very deep question from Danielle Cobb. I'd like us to go to, not necessarily next, but I hope it doesn't get lost in the chat.
Yeah, it's a great question. Let's go to that. How do you suggest repairing and this is a deep one, and probably a long answer, but how do you suggest repairing a broken relationship between the church and school? How do you get everyone on board? Gosh, such a great question. And
I'll take a quick swing at it, and David can take a deeper one. 2 things that I've used systematically. One is a strategic planning process that involves mission, vision, and values. And that would allow getting the schools board and the vestry working together to create something that is about ideas and values and strategies, not about personalities and relationships in real time. The corollary to that is something that David and I heard in a conference last week, which was get a win. Work on something that's important and easy, and enjoy that win together, because trust is built when you accomplish something in partnership. So I'd move towards a common goal with a common outcome. So those are my quick answers. David?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the only other thing I would add would be, depending on how long this situation has gone on for, give yourself time as well.
Mhm.
Like you said, those quick wins, but it's going to take a lot of quick wins. The other thing I like to highlight is, Mary Catherine and I have talked about, was it Rob Bell, Death by Paper Cuts?
Yes.
Talked about, this idea of, he's not an Episcopalian minister, but he's a minister named Rob Bell. And he talks about the importance of becoming a master at the art of forgiveness. And I
Mhm.
think that's in the mix as well, is that we have to all really, really work hard at becoming masters of forgiving people. And that's really, really tough. But in a lot of these situations where we get called into, where there's strained relationship between the church and the parish, there's a lot of backstory, a lot of
Right.
history, and a lot of situations where more often than not, both sides maybe haven't lived up to their expectation. Why is that? Because we're human. I mean,
Right.
welcome to we're human, and welcome to being a human, and none of us are perfect. And so in a lot of these situations where we try to start is by, getting that first win, critically important. What can we focus on with regard to mission, vision, strategies, as Beth has noted, that can get us on the same page? What can we do together that can get us a win to help rebuild that trust? But then it also comes to a point where we have to make a decision. Are we going to forgive what's happened in the past or not? If the answer is or not, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to move forward.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
love
David.
one more, if I may add on to that for a second. I love what David said about slowing down the process. What slowing down the process allows a church and school to do is do that work that needs to be done in forgiving and repairing. And also it allows an opportunity to start fresh again down the road, some number of months, maybe in the next year, and to turn the differences into goals for the future, and bring new and time to get new players on both sides, to enlist a couple of new school board members and a vestry changing its composition a little bit and starting afresh.
Yeah, I like that. David, I know you have to, we're at the top of the hour and I know you have to scoot out. I just wanted to say thank you
Thank
to you for
you.
being a part of this. And I know that, I mean, we all have a love for you because of your relationship with both organizations. And so thank you for being a part and for doing this. Andrew and I are going to stay on and answer a few more questions, but just wanted to say thanks.
Thank you all so much. And thank you to our participants for taking the time to have this conversation. I know this is challenging work, but I really appreciate your dedication to making both our parishes and our schools as strong as they can be. So God bless.
Thank you, David. See you later.
Yeah.
So Andrew, we have one other question I want to get to here, and it's about, well, it's two questions. How would a school benefit from becoming separately incorporated from the church? And for schools that have separately incorporated, what has become, have some become 501c3 nonprofits? And this is all I would add to that. Not every diocese allows a school and a church to become separately incorporated. Some dioceses actually require it. I'm in the Diocese of West Texas. It is not a requirement, but it is suggested. And yes, what happens is they separately incorporate, and they're both 501c3s. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not even an accountant, but so there are some legalities around even when you're separately incorporated that you can, there are some rules around that being under the umbrella of the Episcopal Church USA. But what I would say is that being separately incorporated from the church's standpoint does help in terms of if the school were to ever get sued, it's helpful for them to be a separate entity. That was the reason in our diocese that we began that have to have that conversation. Do you have thoughts around this question?
I don't feel qualified to give advice on it. I simply know that most Episcopal schools I know benefit from having the larger church. um, sponsoring them. And I also know that a separate incorporation does not free you from the school's obligations to the church. So I'm not sure there's an easy answer on outcomes.
Right. And I think there is a little confusion around this idea that, oh, separate incorporation means that the school gets to go do whatever they want to do. And that is not the case, especially if it's a parish day school, because the parish is still kind of, remembering that triangle, the parish still has oversight when it comes to Episcopal identity or financial stewardship. In the Diocese of West Texas, the buildings are owned by the diocese. So we can't just be separately incorporated and go rogue. But I do think that there is a difference between separate incorporation and good governance.
Right.
And you can be separately incorporated and still not have good governance. And you can have good governance and be one entity, legal entity. So I think the answer to the separately incorporated issue really needs to revolve around, number one, what diocese you're in. And number two, kind of get some legal and financial advice around what does that mean for your community.
Yep, exactly.
So I think we've touched on all of the questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. For those of you who stayed with us and are still watching the recording or stayed with us live, thank you so much for being with us. Andrew and I are going to stay on for just a minute if you have additional questions. Andrew, thank you. Great job today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. I'm also going to have to hop on another call in a minute.
Okay.